They laughed. They underestimated. They never thought a nation of island warriors, a country that most outsiders picture through the lens of beaches and festivals, would silence an entire room full of career military officers from some of the most powerful nations on Earth. But that is exactly what happened, and the story of how it happened stretches back centuries, runs through the jungles of Luzon and the mountains of Mindanao, and crashes into the modern era with a force that no one in those war rooms was prepared for. This is the story of a people who were counted out at every single chapter of history, and who responded every single time the same way, by proving the world devastatingly wrong. Long before anyone was putting rankings on military power, the Filipino people were already at war. Not because they chose conquest, but because empires kept showing up at their shores uninvited. The Spanish arrived in the 16th century and assumed that a scattered archipelago of island communities could never unify into a fighting force worth taking seriously. That assumption held for a while, but by 1896, the Katipunan movement had swelled to 30,000 fighters, men and women who had spent generations watching their land be governed by foreign hands. They rose up with whatever they could carry: blades, old rifles, bamboo spears, and launched one of the most significant anti-colonial revolutions in Asian history. The Spanish Empire, which had colonized much of the known world, suddenly found itself on the back foot against people it had dismissed as subjects rather than soldiers. When the Americans arrived after the Spanish-American War and decided to hold on to the Philippines rather than grant the independence Filipinos had been promised, the same pattern repeated itself. The Philippine-American War that followed saw Filipino forces shift brilliantly between conventional battlefield engagements and guerrilla tactics, using intimate knowledge of the terrain to frustrate, delay, and punish a technologically superior opponent. They were eventually subdued, but not before demonstrating something that military historians would keep returning to for the next 100 years. That Filipino fighters, when defending their homeland, were willing to absorb extraordinary punishment and keep moving forward. That willingness was not desperation. It was identity. The moment that changed global perception most dramatically came in the early months of the Second World War. When Japan launched its assault on the Philippines in December 1941, the situation on paper looked hopeless almost immediately. Many Filipino units went into battle without proper equipment, without adequate ammunition, and in some cases without ever having fired the weapons in their hands. Coordination was fractured by language barriers, supply lines were non-existent, and the Japanese military that bore down on Luzon was a seasoned, well-armed force that had already carved through much of East Asia. Every military calculation said the Filipino and American defenders should fold within weeks. They did not fold. On the Bataan Peninsula, those combined forces held the Japanese advance for 3 months in conditions that went beyond grueling. They were sick, starving, outnumbered, and cut off from reinforcement because promises of supplies and troops from across the Pacific never arrived. The military establishment around the world watched in genuine shock. The defense of Bataan became one of the most studied examples of asymmetric resistance in the entire Second World War. Analysts at the time and historians since have pointed to the same quality that kept those men fighting. Not firepower, not logistics, but an almost supernatural capacity to endure. When the peninsula finally fell and the survivors were forced onto the Bataan Death March, where tens of thousands perished in one of the most brutal episodes of the Pacific conflict, the Filipino fighters who escaped into the mountains did not quit. They reformed. They organized into guerrilla cells, numbering more than 260,000 men across the islands. Without central command, without reliable communication, and hunted constantly, they kept the Japanese occupation from ever achieving true stability across the archipelago. The Japanese, one of the most formidable military powers of that era, could not fully pacify a country they had defeated in open battle. That fact alone should have rewritten every assumption the world held about Filipino military capability. It didn't, at least not completely. After the war, the Philippines navigated independence, political turbulence, and a series of internal conflicts that would have destabilized many nations permanently. The communist Hukbalahap rebellion of the late 1940s and early 1950s threatened to tear the country apart. The government's response was to build something new, a specialized fighting unit designed for the specific and brutal demands of jungle counterinsurgency. The First Scout Rangers Regiment was born in November 1950, named after the Alamo Scouts and the American Army Rangers, and trained to operate in the kinds of terrain that conventional forces could never effectively navigate. From the very beginning, the Scout Rangers were not just soldiers. They were hunters, trackers, and close-quarters specialists who absorbed the jungle as naturally as breathing. Within years of their formation, they had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the Hukbalahap rebellion, relying on speed, intelligence, and small unit tactics that kept insurgents constantly off balance. Decades passed, and the Scout Rangers fought in conflict after conflict within the Philippines, each one testing and refining them further. The Moro conflict in Mindanao brought a different kind of challenge. Not a communist insurgency, but a separatist and eventually jihadist movement operating across remote island terrain where conventional military operations were nearly impossible to sustain. The Scout Rangers adapted. That word, adaptation, is perhaps the most accurate single description of the Filipino military tradition. When the equipment is limited, adapt. When the terrain is brutal, adapt. When the enemy changes tactics, adapt faster. This is not a philosophical posture. It is a survival mechanism that has been encoded into the Filipino military identity across centuries of fighting larger and better equipped forces. The moment that truly forced the global military community to pay close attention in the modern era came in 2017 in the city of Marawi in Mindanao. ISIS-aligned militants had seized the city in May of that year, fortifying buildings, tunneling between structures, and establishing a defensive network inside an urban environment that counterterrorism experts described as among the most complex they had ever analyzed. The battle that followed lasted 5 months. It was not a brief operation. It was a grinding, room-by-room, building-by-building campaign through a city that had been deliberately turned into a maze. The armed forces of the Philippines bore the overwhelming weight of that fight, and it cost them dearly. But they retook Marawi. And the way they did it, the coordination, the special forces integration, the adaptability under conditions that would have overwhelmed less experienced forces, drew assessments from military observers around the world that were markedly different in tone from anything that had been said about Filipino soldiers in previous decades. Western military advisors who worked alongside Filipino forces during and after Marawi came back with consistent observations. The Scout Rangers and the Light Reaction Regiment, an even more elite unit drawing its candidates only from soldiers who had already completed the Scout Ranger or Special Forces course and could demonstrate at least 3 years of actual combat experience, showed a level of tactical competence and composure under pressure that required no apology and no qualification. These were not soldiers who needed to be graded on a curve. These were operators who had spent their careers in the harshest possible laboratory, real, sustained conflict, and emerged from it with a skill set that no training exercise can replicate. International military rankings began to note what the record had been quietly documenting for years. The Scout Rangers were among the most experienced counterinsurgency units anywhere in Southeast Asia. Their expertise was not theoretical. It had been paid for in blood across 7 decades of continuous active operations. What makes this story resonate beyond military circles is what it says about identity and resilience. The Philippines is a nation that has been colonized, occupied, liberated, internally divided, and perpetually tested by geography and political circumstance. It is a nation built on over 7,000 islands, spread across typhoon-prone seas, governed through a democratic system that has faced genuine and serious stress at multiple points in its history. And yet through all of it, the Filipino soldier has remained. Not because the pay is exceptional or the equipment is world-class, because on both counts, the armed forces of the Philippines have historically faced serious limitations. but because service in the military carries a meaning in Filipino culture that runs deeper than a career choice. It is tied to a concept of sacrifice and collective identity that stretches back to the Katipunan, to the guerrillas in the mountains during the Japanese occupation, to the men who held baton when every rational calculation said the position was indefensible. The international community is now, belatedly, catching up to what historians have long understood. As tensions in the South China Sea have intensified and the Philippines has found itself navigating one of the most complex maritime disputes in the modern world, the question of what the Filipino military is actually capable of has moved from the background to the very center of geopolitical conversation. Joint exercises with the United States have grown dramatically in scale and ambition. Allies who once viewed the Philippines primarily as a strategic location on the map are increasingly treating the armed forces of the Philippines as genuine partners in capability, not just in geography. The modernization push that has seen the Philippine Navy and Air Force acquiring new platforms from FA-50 light combat aircraft to missile-capable patrol vessels reflects a nation that understands its moment and is moving to meet it. But here is the part that gets lost in all the hardware discussions and geopolitical analysis. The Filipino soldier has never needed the best equipment to be effective. The history says so clearly. At Bataan, they fought on starvation rations with weapons that sometimes did not work. In the mountains of Mindanao, the Scout Rangers operated in terrain and conditions that would be considered training scenarios too extreme to use in exercises in many countries. At Marawi, they went house to house through a city that had been turned into a trap, and they kept going. That quality, that refusal to accept the verdict of disadvantage, is not something that can be purchased with a defense budget. It is grown over generations of proving to every general who underestimated them, to every empire that assumed the answer, that the assumption was wrong. The world is finally paying attention, and the Filipino soldier, the one who fought the Spanish with a bolo and the Japanese with determination, and the insurgents of Mindanao with 70 years of accumulated jungle expertise, is still standing there, patient, battle-tested, entirely unsurprised that it took everyone else this long to notice.